Some days begin with wind, others begin with a cry. That morning, on the front steps of a lonely cabin at the edge of a vast African reserve, came the broken, choking roar of a lioness, dragging her dying cub right to the door. She didn't charge. She didn't roar. She looked at the old man inside, blood in her eyes and a plea buried deep behind them, like a mother begging for her child's life. And then the unbelievable happened. Edward Cole had never been a man of sudden reactions. At 67, he had earned his quiet mornings and preferred the slow rhythm of life that came with isolation. The thatched roof cabin he called home sat alone at the edge of Masai Mara, a wildlife reserve that stretched beyond the horizon like an ocean of golden grass. Here he rose with the sun, brewed weak coffee over an old kerosene stove, and listened to the sound of the wind weaving through acacia trees. Most mornings were uneventful, but not this one. That morning the world was cloaked in mist. A heavy, milky fog hugged the earth, silencing even the usual morning chatter of birds. Edward was standing on his porch, cradling his metal coffee mug in both hands, when he heard it. The roar. But it wasn't a full-bodied roar of dominance or rage. No, this sound was fractured, strained, almost broken. He lowered his cup and squinted toward the tree line, half convinced his aging ears had misheard. Then it came again, a rasping, hoarse sound, like a sob torn from the throat of something far too proud to cry. A lioness? That didn't make sense. Lions didn't cry. And they certainly didn't come this close to man-made dwellings, especially not alone. Instinctively, Edward stepped back into the cabin, set down his cup, and reached for the binoculars hanging by the window. Peering through the murky air, he scanned the tall grass beyond the split-rail fence that marked the edge of his property. At first he saw nothing but mist, then a shadow moved. At the edge of visibility, a shape emerged, large, feline, unmistakable. The lioness stepped forward, her gait slow, uneven. As she drew closer, the fog parted just enough for Edward to see her eyes. They were wide and glassy, not wild, but haunted. Her mouth was slightly open, her sides heaving, and trailing behind her, dragged by the scruff like a limp bundle of fur, was a lion cub, motionless. Edward's heart lurched. She stopped 10 yards from the porch. No snarl, no growl, just the low rise and fall of labored breath. The lioness looked straight at him, then nudged the cub forward with her nose, and then, in a gesture so deliberate it defied logic, she gently lay down in the dirt, resting her head on her forelegs. Her tail didn't twitch, her muscles didn't tense. She was not here to attack. The only sound was the light pattering of dew dripping from leaves and the faint wheeze of the cub's breath, if it was still breathing at all. Edward's fingers trembled. In the decades he'd worked as a wildlife vet across Kenya, Tanzania, and Namibia, he had seen many strange things. But never this. Not a wild lioness, alone, bringing her injured cub to a human. Not like this. He stayed motionless for what felt like an eternity, torn between caution and a sudden surge of urgency. Then he stepped forward. "Easy," he murmured, though more to himself than to the lioness. His boots crunched softly on the gravel as he descended the steps. The lioness did not move. As he approached, the scent hit him first. Blood, dried and fresh, mingled with the sour tang of infection. He dropped to one knee beside the cub. It was a female, barely 3 months old. Her ribs pressed sharply against her skin, her breathing shallow and erratic. There was a deep gash across her flank, already turning black at the edges, and one hind leg was twisted unnaturally. She was on the edge of death. Edward's mind raced. He should call for help. But who? The nearest ranger post was hours away, and even if someone came, it might be too late. And besides, wildlife rescue operations in remote regions like this often suffered from poor coordination and limited medical supplies. He knew that firsthand. The only chance this cub had, if any, was him. He looked up at the lioness. She hadn't moved an inch, but her eyes never left him. They were ancient eyes, grief-stricken, trusting. And that trust, so unnatural, so raw, cut deeper than any claw ever could. "Damn you," he whispered. "You know exactly what you're doing." Edward stood and, moving slowly, scooped the cub into his arms. The lioness tensed just slightly, but then relaxed again. He carried the limp body inside, laying it gently on a folded wool blanket near the hearth. The air in the cabin smelled of old wood and tea leaves. Now it was heavy with the sharp scent of blood. He lit the kerosene lamp, its soft glow washing over the room, and began examining the wounds more closely. He wiped away dirt and dried blood with a warm, damp cloth. The injury on the cub's side was deep, definitely from claws, but not lion claws. Too narrow, too precise. Leopard. The realization made him shiver. Leopards were known to kill lion cubs, often silently and efficiently. They were solitary hunters, cunning and elusive. For a cub to survive such an encounter was nothing short of a miracle. But barely. Edward sterilized a pair of forceps with rubbing alcohol and began to remove bits of debris from the wound. The cub whimpered faintly, a sound so weak it barely registered. Still alive. But fading. He wrapped the leg as best he could, using a splint fashioned from bamboo skewers he kept in the kitchen drawer. It wasn't perfect, but it was stable. He crushed 2 aspirin into powder, mixed it with a bit of honey, and gently applied it to the cub's gums. Not ideal, not veterinary grade. But sometimes pain relief was the only thing that kept the body from shutting down. Outside, the lioness waited. Edward opened the door a crack and stepped out. She raised her head, ears alert. "She's still breathing," he said softly, as if she could understand. "But I don't know for how long." The lioness lowered her head again, blinking slowly. A single tear, or maybe just dew, glimmered at the edge of her eye. Back inside, Edward dug through an old metal case stashed beneath his bed. It held remnants of his old life, antibiotics, syringes, gauze, IV tubes, expired perhaps, but usable. He hung an IV bag from a coat rack and inserted the line with delicate precision. The cub barely flinched. Her body was so depleted it had no energy to protest. Minutes passed, then an hour. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the vastness of the plain. But Edward didn't look. He stayed beside the cub, checking her breathing, adjusting the IV drip, whispering reassurances to no one in particular. He had not touched a wild animal in years. Not since the accident. Not since the day he tried to save a zebra tangled in wire snares and failed to come home in time to say goodbye to his wife. That guilt had driven him here, to the edge of the world, to silence. And now silence had brought something back, something unbelievable. He glanced again at the lioness through the window. She had not moved, not eaten, not slept, just watched, trusted. He wasn't sure what scared him more, her trust or the possibility that he might fail again. A low rumble stirred in the cub's throat. Her eyes fluttered open, just briefly, before closing again. Edward placed a hand gently on her head. "Stay with me," he whispered. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the grass like distant applause. Somewhere far off, a lone elephant bellowed, the sound echoing across the plain. Edward didn't notice. He had already returned to the cub's side, tightening the blanket around her frail body, and preparing for a very long night ahead. The cub did not wake again for a long time. Edward sat on the floor beside the hearth, his back against the rough wooden wall, listening to the faint, uneven rhythm of the cub's breathing. Each breath sounded like it might be the last. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of morning mist, but inside the cabin, time seemed suspended, stretched thin by fear and memory. He checked the IV drip again. The flow was steady, slow enough not to shock her fragile body. Her chest still moved. That was all that mattered. Only then did Edward allow himself to look down at his hands. They were shaking, not from age, from something deeper. He had sworn he would never do this again. Years ago, before this cabin, before the silence, Edward Cole had been one of the most respected wildlife veterinarians working in East Africa. His name had appeared in conservation journals, his interviews quoted in documentaries about endangered species and sustainable wildlife management. Back then, he believed in systems, proper funding, modern veterinary equipment, organized rescue teams, and carefully written protocols. He believed that if you did everything right, life could be saved. That belief died the same day his wife Margaret did. The memory came back now without asking permission. It always did when blood was involved. Margaret had been with him in the field that day, helping tag a tranquilized giraffe for a long-term health monitoring project funded by an international wildlife conservation insurance program. A fallen branch, a startled animal, one wrong step. The radio hadn't worked. The emergency evacuation plan had failed. By the time help arrived, Edward was holding her hand, feeling it go cold, realizing that all his training, all his knowledge, meant nothing in that moment. After the funeral, he walked away from everything: the clinics, the grants, the meetings about funding shortages and rising veterinary malpractice insurance premiums for field doctors. He didn't want to hear words like risk assessment or liability coverage ever again. He came here instead, to the edge of the Mara, to a place where he could pretend he was done saving anything. Now there was blood on his floor again. Edward forced himself to stand. He heated water, cleaned his hands, and returned to the cub. Her fur was matted, stiff with dried blood. As he gently wiped her side, more of the wound became visible. It was worse than he'd thought. The edges were torn, not clean. Definitely claws. And deeper puncture marks beneath. Leopard. The word echoed in his mind like a verdict. Leopards didn't hunt recklessly. They calculated. They struck when escape routes were limited. If a leopard had targeted this cub, it meant the lioness had been distracted, injured, or overwhelmed. Edward glanced toward the door. The lioness was still there. She lay in the shade of an acacia tree now, her body stretched out but tense, her head lifted, just enough to watch the cabin. Flies buzzed around the dried blood on her shoulder and flank. She hadn't moved far since morning, hadn't gone to hunt, hadn't even gone to drink. She was waiting. Edward returned inside and closed the door gently. He knelt again beside the cub and listened to her breathing. Too shallow, her gums were pale. Shock was setting in. He reached into his metal case and hesitated over a small vial of antibiotics. Expired by nearly a year. In the controlled world of modern medicine, this would be unacceptable, a liability nightmare. But out here, in the real world, decisions were not governed by insurance claims or legal consultation fees. They were governed by seconds. He injected a conservative dose into the cub's thigh. Her body twitched weakly in response. "I know," he whispered. "I know it hurts." For a moment, he thought she was slipping away. Her breathing slowed further, her head rolled slightly to the side. Edward pressed his fingers to her chest, counting heartbeats. Then she made a sound. It was barely audible, a thin, broken whimper, but it was enough to make Edward's breath catch. Her eyelids fluttered. Just for a second, but it was real. Outside, the lioness rose to her feet. Edward opened the door just enough for her to see inside. He didn't step out. He didn't need to. The message was in his eyes. "She's still here," he said quietly. "She's fighting." The lioness took one step forward, then another, until she stood just beyond the threshold. She did not cross it. Instead, she lowered her head, pressing her forehead briefly against the wooden doorframe. The gesture was slow, deliberate. It felt like a vow. Edward closed the door again and leaned his forehead against it for a moment, breathing hard. He realized then that this was no longer just about the cub. Somewhere along the way, without asking him, the lioness had placed something else in his care. Trust. He returned to the cub and adjusted the blanket around her body. He spoke softly as he worked, not because he believed she understood the words, but because silence felt dangerous. "You shouldn't have brought her to me," he said. "You should have run, found your pride." But deep down, he knew the answer. She had no one else. As afternoon wore on, the heat outside intensified. Edward closed the shutters to keep the cabin cool, creating a dim, amber-lit space that smelled of antiseptic and old wood. He mashed a small amount of goat milk powder with warm water and tried to feed the cub drop by drop. At first, there was no response. Then, faintly, her tongue moved. It was enough. Edward sat back, exhaustion finally catching up with him. His knees ached, his hands were stiff. He thought of how, in another life, this moment would have involved a full veterinary team, advanced imaging equipment, emergency transport vehicles, and carefully documented treatment plans. The kind of care that usually required expensive wildlife medical coverage and donor-funded emergency response units. Here, it was just him, and a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Edward noticed something else. The lioness had shifted positions. She was closer now, much closer. Sitting directly in front of the cabin, her body aligned with the door, as if standing guard. Edward watched her through the narrow window. Her ears twitched occasionally. Her eyes scanned the grass, the shadows growing longer by the minute. She was protecting them. The realization sent a chill through him. If a leopard had attacked once, it could return. Night was its domain. Edward checked the locks on the door, checked the fuel in his lantern. He reached for the old radio on the shelf and tested the signal. Static. Then, faintly, a voice from a distant ranger post crackled through before fading again. Not reliable enough. He turned back to the cub. Her breathing was steadier now, though still weak. He rested a hand on her small, warm body and felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope? Outside, the first stars began to appear. Somewhere in the tall grass, something moved. The lioness stiffened, muscles coiling beneath her fur. Edward swallowed hard. Whatever was coming next, this night would test more than his skills as a veterinarian. It would test whether a man who had once walked away from saving lives could still stand by the promise he had just made, spoken not in words, but in blood. He stayed where he was, beside the cub, listening to the sounds of the African night closing in, knowing that by morning everything could change. Darkness settled over the Mara like a curtain falling after the final act, swallowing the landscape in layers of silence and shadow. Inside the cabin, Edward sat in a wooden chair beside the lion cub, his eyes half closed, his hand still resting gently across her chest, feeling for every shallow breath. She had made it through the day, just barely. Outside the window, the lioness had not moved from her vigil. Her silhouette was barely visible in the moonlight, but Edward could sense her presence with a strange certainty. She hadn't eaten, hadn't sought water. She waited, unblinking, as if guarding not only her cub, but something larger, an unspoken bond of final hope. Edward stood slowly, knees cracking, and made his way to the corner cabinet where he kept his small supply of emergency flares. Just in case. He checked the fuel level in the lantern, then secured the front door with the old bolt. The air was thick with humidity and dust. Crickets screamed from the tall grass, and somewhere far off, A hyena cackled into the dark. He didn't like it. There was a stillness tonight that wasn't natural. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that came just before something snapped. He returned to the cub and gently adjusted the cloth over her wounded side. The bleeding had stopped for now, but the infection was creeping, red and angry, around the gash. Antibiotics had slowed it, but not stopped it. She was in no shape to move, and even if she could, there was nowhere safer than right here. He leaned back in the chair and let his mind drift, though sleep was distant. As he watched the flickering lantern light on the log walls, a memory surfaced, uninvited. Years ago, he'd treated a cheetah with a shattered pelvis. Snare trap injury. The rangers who brought it in said she wouldn't make it through the night. Edward stayed with her anyway, whispering nonsense as he monitored her pulse, adjusting fluids, managing pain. In the end, she survived. Months later, he saw her again, limping but alive, with 2 cubs in tow. It wasn't the skill that saved her. It was presence, a body next to another, refusing to give up. The lantern sputtered. Then, outside, a sound. Not the lioness. Something heavier than wind. Something slinking. Edward went to the window and peered into the dark. For a moment he saw nothing. Then he saw them. Eyes. 2 glinting orbs, low to the ground, reflecting the cabin's faint light. Wide set, unblinking, staring directly at the porch. Leopard? He cursed under his breath. It hadn't come alone the first time. Maybe it had failed once. But leopards were silent opportunists, patient, vengeful. The lioness rose, muscles stiff. She took 1 step forward, baring her teeth in the direction of the grass. The leopard didn't flinch. It remained where it was, calculating. Edward grabbed the flare gun from its hook by the door. He stepped onto the porch, keeping low, his heart pounding. The lioness moved past. Him, her body brushing his shoulder as she advanced. Edward had never been this close to an adult lion without tranquilizers or a steel cage between them. But she ignored him, focused only on the predator in the dark. She growled, not the deep territorial roar of dominance, but a low, guttural warning. It rolled across the ground like distant thunder. The eyes disappeared. For a moment, nothing. Then movement, fast, low, silent. The leopard burst from the grass with terrifying grace. It didn't aim for the lioness. It darted around, toward the side of the cabin, trying to flank. Edward fired. The flare screamed into the air, exploding in a burst of red above the cabin, bathing the clearing in firelight. The leopard stopped short, disoriented, snarling. The lioness pounced. They collided just beyond the porch in a flurry of muscle, claws, and sand. Edward backed away, breath caught in his throat. The leopard was smaller, faster, but the lioness had fury. She struck again and again, driving it back into the grass, away from the cabin, away from the cub. Then silence. Edward stood frozen, the flare gun dangling in his hand, the smoke drifting skyward like a ghost. The lioness returned 20 minutes later, limping. Her shoulder bled anew. She didn't lie down this time. She stood at the doorway, body heaving, gaze fixed on Edward. He opened the door slowly. She didn't enter. She just stared, as if saying, "You saw. You know now." He nodded once, unable to speak. The lioness lowered her head and retreated to the side of the cabin, out of sight but near. Inside, the cub whimpered in her sleep. Edward returned to her, sat down, and placed his hand over her side again. Her heartbeat was fast but steady. He whispered without thinking, "She fought for you." The night wore on. Hours passed. Edward dozed fitfully in the chair, the flare gun resting in his lap. He dreamed of eyes in the dark, of Margaret's voice calling his name through. The wind. He awoke before dawn, stiff and cold, and checked the cub again, still breathing. He made tea from dry herbs, watching the sky lighten. As the first sliver of sun crept over the horizon, he stepped outside. The lioness was gone. Not far, he saw her in the distance, standing on a low rise, watching the valley beyond. The blood on her fur had dried. She looked thinner now, fainter. He didn't know how much longer she could stay. Back inside, he cleaned the cub's wound again and administered another dose of antibiotics. She stirred, her eyes flickering open for a moment. He smiled, a rare thing these days. "You're not done," he said softly. "Not yet." That afternoon, he used the radio to send a message through the emergency frequency. Short, urgent, coded. 2 hours later, the crackling voice of Dr. Amara came through. Edward's voice was calm but tight. "I need your help." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. He returned to the cub and held her close, the hum of the radio still faint in the background. Somewhere out in the world, help was coming. But here, on the edge of the Mara, it was just a man, a wounded lioness, and a cub too small to survive, unless all three of them refused to let go. The next morning arrived in fragments, sunlight streaming through the shutters, the kettle hissing on the stove, the low hum of the radio still pulsing like a heartbeat against the wall. Edward hadn't really slept. Every time his head dipped forward, he would jolt awake, afraid the cub's breath might have stopped in the quiet. But she was still breathing. Weaker, yes. Slower. Her body was fighting something deep, something creeping beneath the skin. The wound had begun to leak again during the night. Edward had flushed it with what little sterile solution he had left and rewrapped it carefully, using strips from his old t-shirt. He was running out of supplies. He stared at the cub now, her flank rising and falling with ragged rhythm. Her tiny chest shivered with each breath. He could see the fever in the way her muscles twitched, in the dull cloud veiling her golden eyes when they flickered open. She had gone longer than 24 hours without real nourishment. Edward stood slowly and stretched his back, the bones in his spine crackling like dry sticks. Then he walked to the cabinet where an old box of powdered goat milk sat untouched for years. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't even close to the kind of specialized wildlife milk formula veterinarians used for orphaned predators. But it was all he had, and the cub couldn't wait. He boiled water, mixed the powder into a thin paste, and waited for it to cool. Using a rubber dropper, he began feeding her again, one drop at a time against the roof of her mouth. It was slow work. Half of it dribbled down her jaw, but now and then her tongue moved. She swallowed. That was hope. Outside, the lioness remained out of sight. He hadn't seen her since she climbed that rise at dawn. Part of him feared she was gone. Another part feared she was dying somewhere close by, alone in the grass, refusing to leave, but too wounded to return. The radio crackled again. Edward rushed to it, adjusting the frequency. Dial with careful fingers. Then a voice broke through, clearer this time. "Edward, it's Amara. Copy?" He pressed the transmit button. "I'm here," he said. "Thank you for answering." "How bad is it?" "Cub's infected, hind leg fracture, puncture wound to abdomen, weak vitals, low temp. I've stabilized for now, but I don't have enough to keep her going." Silence on the line for a moment. Then, "And the mother?" Edward hesitated. "She's nearby. She brought the cub to me." There was another pause. "You're not joking." "No." "I'll leave now," Amara said. "It'll take me 3 hours. I'm bringing Keto. Hold on." He didn't say thank you. There was no need. She wouldn't have come if she didn't believe him. Edward stood by the window and looked out across the plain. The sun was higher now, glaring off the dry earth, casting long blue shadows under the acacia trees. If the leopard was still out there, it hadn't shown itself again. Still, something didn't sit right. The cub whimpered a tiny cracked sound. Edward returned to her side, checked the IV bag, almost empty. He swapped it out for the last one. "Help's coming," he murmured. "You just have to make it till then." The hours that followed stretched like rubber. Every sound outside made him flinch. Every breeze that stirred the grass looked like danger. He kept the door locked, the flare gun close, and a knife tucked in his belt just in case. Not that it would do much against Claws. When the rumble of an engine finally reached his ears, it felt like a hallucination. He stepped onto the porch and scanned the horizon. A black Land Cruiser, coated in red dust, approached from the ridge road. Edward waved his hand in the air. The vehicle crawled to a stop outside the cabin. The driver's door opened. Amara stepped out first. Same as ever, tall and lean, her hair pulled back into a tight braid, khaki, shirt damp with sweat. Behind her came Quito, barely 20, quiet and wide-eyed, carrying 2 packs, one medical, one mechanical. Edward opened the cabin door wider and waved them in without a word. Amara's eyes went straight to the cub. "Oh, God!" she said under her breath, dropping to her knees beside the blanket. Her hands moved quickly, checking temperature, inspecting the bandages, lifting the eyelids. "You weren't kidding," she said. "This little one's barely hanging on." "I told you," Edward said. Quito passed her the equipment bag, and she opened it, pulling out antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, injectable fluids. As she prepared the syringes, she asked quietly, "Do we know what did this?" "Leopard? Alone?" "I think so, but I can't be sure." "She'll need more than this. This is triage, not treatment." "I know." Amara gave the first injection, followed by a quick subcutaneous fluid dose. The cub whimpered faintly, but didn't resist. Edward stood nearby, watching. Quito opened the second bag and began assembling a portable warmer, basically a battery-powered heating pad wrapped in insulation. They slipped it under the cub to stabilize her core temperature. "You did good," Amara said, not looking at him. "I didn't have a choice." She glanced up. "You always have a choice." Edward didn't answer. When the cub had settled, Amara finally stood and stretched her back. "Now tell me about the mother." Edward stepped outside and gestured toward the ridge. "She was there this morning, injured. She fought off a leopard 2 nights ago. Took a few hits. I haven't seen her since." As if summoned, the Lioness appeared. She emerged from the tree line slowly, limping badly, her ribs more pronounced, her gait weak. She didn't come all the way to the cabin. She stopped 30 yards out and sat, head held low. Quito whispered, "She looks like she's bleeding again." "She is," Edward said. Amara studied her silently. "This isn't normal," she murmured. "They don't do this." "She did?" Amara turned back toward the cabin. "Let's get the cub stable. Then we'll see what we can do about her." That night the cabin filled with quiet motion. Medical routines, timed doses, new fluids, monitors blinking faintly in the corner. Outside, the Lioness remained, close but not too close. Edward stepped out once, carrying a basin of water and a plate of meat scraps. He left them just beyond the steps. In the morning, they were gone, not a sound. Amara worked through the night, and Edward stayed with her. Quito dozed briefly on a cot in the corner. At one point, Amara looked up from her notes and said, "You still have the hands for this?" Edward didn't reply. He couldn't. When dawn came, the cub opened her eyes fully for the first time. Not just flickering, not fading. She looked at Edward and blinked once. Then twice. Alive. He reached down and touched her cheek gently with one finger. "You did it," he said. She closed her eyes again, but this time not from exhaustion, from rest. Outside, the wind stirred the grass, and the first rays of sun caught on the edge of the Lioness's fur. She sat motionless, watching the door. Edward stepped outside, his voice barely louder than the breeze. "She's still alive," he said. "Because of you." The Lioness didn't respond, But she didn't leave either. By the second day, the cabin had transformed into a space that looked more like a makeshift emergency ward than the humble home of an aging recluse. There were folded blankets lining the floor, sterilized gauze drying by the window, and soft medical beeps breaking the stillness of the savannah air. The cub, who now stirred with more purpose in her limbs, was slowly coming back from the cliff's edge. Edward had stayed by her side nearly every hour, administering fluids, checking vitals, and whispering softly when her eyes opened. Amara and Keto had set up a small observation schedule, trading rest periods between treatments, but Edward refused to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the leopard's glowing stare through the mist. Every time he dozed, he heard Margaret's voice calling his name and fading into silence. Outside, the lioness had not moved far. She lay beneath the same thorn tree where she'd watched her cub disappear into Edward's cabin. She was weaker. Now, her movements stiffer, and flies clung to the caked blood around her flank. She hadn't hunted, hadn't eaten. She was slowly unraveling, but she wouldn't leave, not until the cub could stand. Amara had tried approaching her that morning with a tranquilizer dart tucked in her vest in case of aggression. But the lioness didn't charge. She didn't growl. She simply rose, backed away a few paces, and watched with eyes that had stopped pleading and now only waited. "She's bleeding internally," Amara had said quietly as they walked back to the cabin. "You can see it in her steps. That hip wound's deep. She's not going to last long like this." Edward didn't say anything. The words hung between them like a warning neither could bear to speak. By afternoon, the cub had taken her first unassisted steps. It wasn't much. A wobble, a tremble. 3 seconds of forward motion before collapsing gently onto the folded towel beneath her. But it was more than they expected. Keto had burst into a quiet cheer, and Amara had allowed herself a small, rare smile. Edward, though, simply knelt beside her and whispered, "Good girl." He left the door open longer that day, letting the breeze carry the cub's scent out to where the lioness lay. The moment it did, she stood, her ears perked, her nose lifted to the air. "She knows," Edward murmured. But the day wouldn't end peacefully. Near sundown, as golden light painted the tall grass in hues of amber and fire, the wind shifted. Edward was outside stacking firewood by the side of the house when he felt it again, that sense of being watched. This time it wasn't the lioness. He turned slowly, squinting toward the tree line. There, a slinking shadow, a slow, purposeful movement just beyond the reach of light, low to the ground, head angled downward, a flash of white under the eyes. Leopard. Edward dropped the firewood and stepped backward into the cabin. The door slammed shut behind him. "Amara," he called, "we've got company." She was already at the window. She'd seen it too. Keto scrambled to lock the back door and grabbed the flare gun they'd reloaded 2 nights ago. The air inside the cabin thickened, as if the space itself held its breath. The leopard wasn't here for a second attempt. It was here to finish the job. Edward looked at the cub, who had dozed off again, chest rising in smooth rhythm. She didn't know. She couldn't know. Amara leaned forward slightly at the window. "It's circling." "It's hunting," Edward said. Then a sound none of them expected broke the silence. A low growl from outside. The lioness. Before anyone could react, she was on her feet, limping toward the trees with surprising speed. The growl deepened, became a roar, not full-bodied, but raw, a torn version of the voice she once had. She vanished into the tall grass, her body swallowed by the shadows. Edward moved to the front steps and stared, unable to look away. For several minutes, nothing. Then the grass exploded, a blur of movement, fur, claws, snarls. The leopard launched upward, trying to pounce from the high grass, but the lioness had anticipated it. She struck with her remaining strength, driving the smaller cat sideways into the dirt. They clashed just yards from the porch. This time there was no graceful evasion. It was fury against fury. The lioness bit down on the leopard's neck, but her weakened body betrayed her. The leopard clawed her chest, wriggled free, and leapt back, but not away. It prepared for a second strike. "Flare?" Edward said. Quito raised the gun and fired. The sky lit up with a hiss of white and red. Startled, the leopard hissed, turned, and vanished into the darkness of the trees. The lioness collapsed onto her side, panting, trembling, blood soaking through her fur again. Edward ran to her. "No closer," Amara warned, but he didn't stop. He knelt beside the lioness, who didn't lift her head, only looked at him through half-lidded eyes. Her breathing was shallow, too shallow. "She's crashing," Amara said, catching up. That fight finished what was left of her strength. Edward pressed a hand gently to her side. Her body was burning with fever. Her wound had reopened fully. "We can help her," Quito said softly. Amara shook her head. "We'd need a full surgical setup, and even then—" Edward didn't answer. He just sat beside the lioness, resting his palm lightly on her flank. She blinked once at him, then closed her eyes. For a long while, no one spoke. They carried her to the side of the cabin, under the shade where she had always watched. Edward laid a blanket across the grass, and they lowered her carefully onto it. She didn't protest. He stayed with her for hours. That night, as the stars came out one by one, Edward sat beside her and whispered every story he could remember. About Margaret, about the cheetah he saved, about the cub inside who had just started walking. He didn't know if she could hear him. He spoke anyway. At some point in the night, she passed, quietly, without pain. He found her in the early hours, her eyes still closed, body still warm. He didn't weep. He didn't say anything at all. He just nodded once, slowly, like someone acknowledging a contract fulfilled. Then he stood, walked into the cabin, and sat beside the cub. "She's gone," he whispered. The cub looked at him, eyes open. She didn't understand. But somehow she seemed to know something had changed. Edward stayed beside her as the sun rose. He had seen death before, but never like this, never with so much life left behind. The sun rose slow and silent over the Mara, casting pale gold across the fields where dust still hung from the battle the night before. The morning wind was gentle. It stirred the tips of the grass and traced the blanket that covered her body. Soft wool, worn with time, now draped across the lioness who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. Edward stood alone just beyond the porch, staring at her. There had been no struggle, no last breath filled with panic. Only a quiet fading, a surrender, the kind of end that came not from fear, but from completion. He crouched and laid a hand once more on her side. Cold now. The fever gone, because she was gone. Her eyes remained closed. It was the only grace the night had left. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Amara stepped out, arms folded across her chest. She didn't speak at first. She simply stood there, watching the old man say goodbye to a lioness like one might to a friend. The moment didn't require words. "You want help burying her?" she asked gently. Edward shook his head. "I'll do it." "You sure?" "I owe her that." He didn't look back when she stepped away. He moved with purpose, gathering tools from the shed, an old iron spade, a rusted pickaxe. The ground was dry, sun-baked. It would take all day. But he didn't mind. The lioness had crossed impossible terrain to save her child. This was the least he could give her in return. He picked a spot under the thorn tree where she had first appeared days ago, not far from where she had laid down that bleeding cub and placed all her trust in a man who had nearly forgotten what it meant to be trusted. By midday, the hole was deep enough. Amara returned, silent, with Quito following behind. They helped lift her gently. No words, no prayer, just quiet hands. They laid her in the earth as the wind picked up again and dust danced across the savannah like ash. Edward stepped back, placed a flat stone at her head, and remained still for a long moment. Then he turned and walked inside. The cub was awake. She watched him from the folded blanket she had claimed as her bed, her golden eyes bright with fever's absence. She didn't cry. She didn't make a sound. But when Edward knelt beside her, she leaned forward, slowly, and pressed her small head against his hand. It was the first time she'd done that. He let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding, and whispered, "She's not coming back, little one. It's just us now." They stayed like that for a while, man and cub, the weight of grief softened by the warmth of something that still lived. Later that afternoon, Amara prepared to leave. She'd received a call, another emergency on the far side of the reserve. A wounded giraffe tangled in poachers' snares. Her work never ended. Edward stood with her at the jeep, Quito already inside. "She's strong," Amara said, nodding toward the cabin. "She's her mother's daughter," Edward replied. Amara hesitated, then reached into her vest and pulled out a small tin box. Inside were several vials, syringes, a digital thermometer, and a packet of antibiotic powder. For the next few days, inject every 12 hours, mix that powder with water, and see if she'll drink. And call me if anything changes. Edward nodded and took the box. "I'm leaving her in your care," Amara said. "I know she's in the right hands." As the jeep drove away, kicking up a trail of red dust, Edward stood in the heat and watched until the vehicle became a blur on the horizon. When he stepped back inside, the cub was trying to stand again. She had grown stronger, even in the hours since the morning. Her front paws pressed into the rug, and her back legs followed, but she wobbled and sank down again. She looked at him, unbothered, ready to try again. "All right," he said softly. "Let's take this one step at a time." Over the next few days, a new rhythm emerged. He fed her small pieces of meat mixed with formula, cleaned her wound with careful hands, and supported her weight as she learned to walk without limping. The antibiotics worked. The infection receded. Her eyes brightened. He named her Hope. It was simple, maybe too obvious, but it fit. He found himself saying it aloud in the mornings, calling her from the porch when she wandered too close to the edge of the tall grass. Hope not there. Or later in the evening, when she curled beside the hearth, her breathing soft and deep. Good girl, Hope. The name filled the cabin in a way silence never had. Each night he'd leave the door open just a little, out of habit, as if expecting to see the Lioness outside again. He never did, but sometimes, in the breeze, he thought he heard her, one last breath carried on the wind. On the 5th night after the burial, a storm rolled in. Rain fell hard against the tin roof, and thunder cracked through the Mara like cannon fire. Hope panicked. She ran to him wide-eyed, heart pounding against his chest when he picked her up. He wrapped her in an old blanket, held her through the worst of it. Somewhere deep in the dark, lightning flashed, and he imagined the leopard out there still, stalking. But not tonight. Tonight they were safe. He stayed awake, rocking gently, watching shadows shift across the walls. And for the first time in years he prayed, not to any god, but to the Lioness, buried just beyond the door, a promise more than a plea. I won't fail her. Morning came quiet. The world outside washed clean, greener somehow. Hope walked from the cabin that day on her own, steady and sure. She sniffed the air, stared into the trees, then trotted back to him, her tail flicking like a question. He smiled. They would have more storms, more setbacks. But for now, they had a chance. Edward stood on the porch and looked at the tree beneath which the lioness rested. The soil there had settled. Flowers, small and yellow, were growing beside the stone. He didn't plant them. They just appeared. He sat on the steps and watched Hope chase a leaf across the yard, and in that moment he understood something he hadn't let himself believe for a long time. She hadn't just left her cub. She had left him something to live for. The dry season rolled across the Mara like a tide of heat and dust, curling the edges of leaves and painting the sky in permanent haze. It had been nearly 3 weeks since Edward buried the lioness beneath the thorn tree. In that time, Hope had grown stronger by the day. Her limp remained, but it was barely noticeable now, just a faint hitch in her step when she turned too quickly or braced herself awkwardly before lying down. Her coat had regained its golden shine, and her eyes tracked movement with an alertness that reminded Edward of the wild that still lived inside her. Each morning they greeted the sun together, Edward with a cup of coffee, Hope with a slow stretch on the porch and a long yawn that showed off her small but sharp teeth. She explored more now, venturing a few dozen yards beyond the cabin, sniffing at roots and rocks, stalking bugs in the tall grass, her instincts sharpening like blades on stone. But she always returned, always to sit beside him in the shade, pressing her warm body lightly against his leg as if to say, "I know where home is." Amara and Quito returned once a week, each time carrying new supplies and checking on Hope's progress. Quito, especially, had grown attached. He would sit cross-legged on the floor, hand-feeding Hope morsels of meat while speaking to her in Swahili, smiling when she flicked her tail or pawed at his shoelaces. "She's not just recovering," Amara said during one visit. "She's bonding. You're her pride now." Edward didn't respond to that, not right away. He only watched Hope nap beside the hearth, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt like safety. It was around this time that the first stranger appeared. One morning, just after dawn, Edward spotted a dust trail on the horizon, a four-wheel drive vehicle inching along the ridge road like a beetle crawling across a branch. Visitors were rare out here. The road wasn't marked on most maps, and Edward had never shared his location with anyone who didn't need to know. The vehicle stopped near the fence line. A tall man stepped out. Broad-shouldered, wearing a tan ranger's vest and mirrored sunglasses, he moved like someone who thought every step belonged to him. Edward walked out to meet him. "Morning," the man said. "You Edward Cole?" "I am." "Name's Jonas Weller, Wildlife Compliance Division." Edward folded his arms. "Don't believe we've met." "No, sir, but you've been reported." Edward narrowed his eyes. "For what?" Weller pulled a small tablet from his vest and tapped the screen. "It says here you're harboring a juvenile predator, African lion, female, approximately 4 months. Unauthorized rehabilitation without proper permit. That about right?" Edward kept his expression neutral. "Her mother brought her to me. She was dying." "Not the question I asked." "I didn't exactly have time to file paperwork." Weller sighed. "Sir, I understand, but we have rules for a reason. Lions aren't pets. They're protected species, even injured ones." "She's not a pet?" "No, she's a liability. If she hurts someone or escapes and wanders into a populated area, who takes responsibility? You? The reserve? Our department?" "She's not going anywhere." "That's not your call." Hope appeared behind Edward then, standing at the edge of the porch. She looked at Weller, her tail flicking once, and stepped down the steps slowly, confidently, her limp barely visible. Weller flinched. "She's tame," he said. "No," Edward replied. "She trusts me. That's different." Weller tapped on his tablet again. "We'll need to assess her. Might have to move her to a holding facility until further evaluation. You'll have to go through Dr. Amara." "I already did. She said it was up to Central Authority." "Then I guess you're wasting your time here." For a long moment, the Iambal two men stared at each other. Hope stood between them, looking from one to the other, tail still. Then Weller nodded. "I'll file a report. Expect follow-up." He turned, walked back to the vehicle, and drove away without another word. Edward stood still until the dust settled. Hope looked up at him, then brushed against his leg. He reached down and stroked her back. "They won't take you," he said. "Not now. Not after everything." But the encounter left a stone in his stomach. He had lived long enough to know that systems rarely listen to reason. Even in the world of conservation, where the words ethical wildlife care and animal rescue carried weight, there were politics, there were lawsuits, there were insurance companies with clauses thicker than the laws themselves. A single mistake could ruin everything. That night he sat on the porch with Hope curled at his feet. He looked up at the stars, trying to make sense of the new shape his life had taken. The quiet he once craved had been replaced by the soft breathing of a lion cub who trusted him with every part of her fragile world. "I didn't ask for this," he said aloud, "but I'm not giving it up." Hope stirred, resting her head on his boot. In the days that followed, Edward made small changes. Reinforced the perimeter fencing, added extra latches to the doors. He cleared the satellite phone and reprogrammed emergency contacts. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew how things worked. You couldn't keep something wild without someone eventually trying to take it away. Then one morning, something unexpected happened. Hope didn't come back right away. She had wandered off as usual to chase insects near the creek that curved through the far edge of his property. But she didn't return for lunch. Or for her midday nap. Edward whistled for her, called her name. No response. By late afternoon, panic began to bloom in his chest. He grabbed his walking stick and headed into the tall grass, following the narrow path she usually took. The sun beat down hard, sweat soaked his shirt, his knees ached. Then he heard it, a rustle, a soft growl. He pushed through a thick patch of brush and froze. Hope was there, crouched low, staring at something beneath the roots of a fallen tree. It was a tortoise. She didn't attack it, just watched it, pawed it once, then looked up as Edward stepped forward. Her eyes said it all. "I'm okay. I'm learning." He exhaled, bent down beside her, and ran a hand over her back. "You're not mine to keep forever," he whispered, "but you're not ready yet." As they walked back together, Edward knew the clock had started ticking. Weller would return, or someone else, and eventually he'd have to make a choice. But not yet, not today. For now, Hope walked beside him, tail high, steps sure. And Edward, for the first time in years, didn't feel alone. The first storm of the short, wet season came without warning. It crept in on a wind that smelled of distant rivers, gathering weight above the Mara like a held breath. By the time Edward noticed the shift in the air, the sky had already darkened to the color of bruised stone. Thunder grumbled in the east, and the trees began to bend. Inside the cabin, Hope paced near the window. She was larger now, almost half his height at the shoulder, and stronger. She had outgrown the pile of blankets by the hearth, and instead claimed the corner beneath the bookshelf where she could see both the door and the man who had become her world. But the storm made her uneasy. It reminded her of the night the lightning flashed and her mother didn't wake up. Edward poured water into her bowl, placed it beside her, then knelt. "It's just rain," he said, his voice low and steady. You're safe." She looked at him, eyes round and gold, ears twitching at each distant rumble. Outside, the Ioi storm broke. Rain slammed against the roof in thick sheets, the sound drumming loud and relentless. The air turned cold. Hope pressed herself against Edward's leg. He rested a hand on her back and waited. The storm lasted all night. By morning, the ground was soft, the sky washed clean. Puddles shimmered between the trees, and birds returned cautiously to the branches, shaking water from their feathers. Edward opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Hope followed, tail flicking, sniffing the air. The scent of wet soil, flowers in bloom, and something else, something old, rose up from the earth. He stood there for a long time, watching the way the sunlight played on the grass. And that's when he saw them. Tracks, fresh ones, not Hope's, not his, larger, deeper, spread with weight. Lioness. Edward's breath caught. He stepped forward slowly, careful not to disturb the outline of the prints. They led from the far side of the ridge, down the gentle slope, and stopped in front of the cabin, directly in front of the door. Then they turned away again. He followed the path for a dozen yards, but the trail ended where the sun had already begun drying the earth. Still, he saw enough to be sure. The Lioness had come here. Not one of the local prides. Not a wanderer. Her. He turned back toward the cabin. Hope stood at the threshold, watching him. Her ears perked, and she stepped out into the sun. She sniffed the prints, then looked up at him. There was no fear in her eyes, just curiosity. "She came back," Edward whispered. "Not in body, but in spirit. Or maybe she had never really left." Hope brushed past him and trotted into the clearing, moving with purpose now. She stopped beneath the thorn tree, the same one her mother had once laid beneath, waiting for a miracle. She sat down and stared into the distance. That was the day Edward knew the decision had already been made. It was time to let her go. He spent the next week preparing. He contacted Amara, who agreed to help coordinate with the reserve's reintegration unit. They would monitor her, ensure she had access to food, and follow her movements using a small tracking collar until she could find her place in the wild. No holding pens, no cages. Not for this one. She had earned more than that. When the team arrived, Edward insisted on fitting the collar himself. Hope didn't resist. She sat still as he buckled the device gently around her neck. He whispered the whole time, not that she needed the words, but he needed to say them. "You're ready. You've always been ready. I just wasn't." Amara stayed long enough to finalize the paperwork. Keto stood beside the truck, wiping his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Then it was time. Edward opened the gate and stepped aside. Hope looked at him. She didn't run. She didn't bolt. She walked, steady, strong, straight into the tall grass where her kind belonged. He watched until she vanished. The next morning he woke earlier than usual. The silence was louder without her. He boiled water, made coffee, sat on the porch, and waited, not for her to return, but for whatever came next. 3 days passed, then a week, then 2. And one morning, just after rain had fallen again, he opened the door and saw them. 2 sets of prints, one small, one large, side by side. No sign of a body, no sound in the distance. Just the trail left behind. He stepped into the yard and knelt beside the tracks. They were fresh, not wet, not distorted. Hope had returned, but she wasn't alone. He didn't call out. He didn't go looking. He only smiled. She had found her place. He rose, walked back into the cabin, and sat at the table. The sun rose higher, warming the walls, casting light across the floorboards. On the mantel, above the fireplace, sat the carved stone he had taken from her mother's resting place. Beside it, a picture of Margaret, weather-worn and sun-faded. He looked at both and whispered, "I kept my promise." Outside, the Mara breathed. Edward Cole closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, peace didn't feel like loneliness.